Bombing resumes as the latest ceasefire unravels in Syria. What's next for the embattled country? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Syrian army has declared the 7-day truce over, blaming insurgents for violating the ceasefire at least 300 times. And while bombing resumes, Russian and US officials are scrambling to try to salvage the carefully crafted agreement that was put into place just last week. Diplomats expressed hope that the latest truce would last long enough for humanitarian aid to reach those who needed it most. And while some food, water and hygiene supplies did manage to reach those in need, a convoy destined for about 275,000 civilians in rebel-held eastern parts of Aleppo remains stalled. All this as a verbal battle broke out at the United Nations over the weekend between Russia and the United States over a US-led airstrike that killed over 60 Syrian troops. There's much to talk about. Joining us now from Damascus is CCTV's Ala Ibrahim. And Ala, bring us up to date on the humanitarian situation in Aleppo and beyond, and how much aid has got through.
Well, actually, not only that, no aid has actually entered the besieged city of Aleppo. The situation got much more complicated on Monday when an airstrike targeted a convoy carrying aid shipments heading towards the city of Aleppo, 15 kilometers west of Aleppo, which killed at least one aid worker along with several civilians. And this has put a great deal of strain on the aid delivery plans in Syria. The United Nations, as a result, has suspended all its aid convoys in the country, and this is adding to the suffering of millions of Syrians who are now completely dependent on United Nations aid for their survival. Recent shipments have actually made it to some areas across the country, like Al-Mu'addamiyya in western countryside of Damascus. But the main target of the deal between Russia and the United States, which started with the ceasefire and then subsequently aid deliveries, was to deliver aid to the rebel-held eastern parts of Aleppo, which has never happened. It's also worth mentioning that the situation is maybe complicated because the United Nations is rightfully asking for guarantees for the safety and safe passage of all its convoys in Syria, but the Syrian government, coordinating with the Syrian government, is not very smooth, as you can imagine, and there's a large number of rebel factions acting on the ground in Syria, which makes coordinating any convoy to cross into different areas of control near impossible, bearing in mind that last week the Syrian government issued a statement saying no aid convoys will be allowed into the country without prior coordination with it and with the United Nations, which also made the situation extremely difficult because countries like Turkey, for example, that wanted to dispatch a convoy of aid that's sat on the borders between Turkey and Syria for days, did not go through with aid dispatchment because it does not recognize, let alone coordinate with the Syrian government, and this has deprived many Syrians of aid that they needed.
Now, Ala, with the apparent collapse of this latest ceasefire, where do things go to from here?
Well, this is the $1 million question that actually no one has an accurate answer for. But it will all come down to the negotiations of the two superpowers, Russia and the United States, who have become directly involved in the conflict in Syria. But there are two theories here inside Syria that people speak about when discussing what will happen next. The first theory, which is the theory of the Syrian government, and that is after the deal has failed and after the ceasefire expired, Russia will now step up its military support for the Syrian army, which will enable the Syrian army to have a better standing in the battlefield across the country in various front lines. And in a few weeks, the Russians would go back to negotiate with the Americans for better terms. The rebels, on the other hand, have another theory. Their theory is the elections in the United States will take place in November. They expect that by then it's very likely that Hillary Clinton will be sitting in the Oval Office, and they also expect that Clinton on top of the United States would mean that the chances of a military intervention by America in Syria would be much greater, and that military intervention could overthrow the government of President Bashar al-Assad and turn the whole battle in favor of the rebels. But regardless of both theories, facts on the ground suggest that upcoming days will witness more violence. Rebels have used the time of the ceasefire to regroup and plan another attack on the city of Aleppo, and government forces are showing no signs of backing off, so the situation will only stand to escalate in upcoming days.
Thanks, Ala. That's CCTV's Ala Ibrahim reporting from Damascus. Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining us via Skype is Andrew Tabler. He focuses on Syria and U.S. policy at the Washington Institute. And joining us from Damascus is Syrian journalist Muhammad Ali. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Muhammad Ali, let me start with you. The ceasefire that was brokered by the United States and Russia has now broken, and we've had a UN aid convoy that's been blown up by bombs. What is the situation in Syria right now, and where does it go to from here?
Well, the situation, as you have just said, the ceasefire ended. There has been no extension. What we know is that, yes, there was also an attack targeting a humanitarian convoy just west of Aleppo in a village called Oram al-Kubra. No one claimed responsibility for the attack. The opposition is accusing the Syrian government. However, the Syrian Army's General Command issued an official statement confirming that it did not actually attack this aid convoy, and it doesn't even make sense to believe that the Syrian army attacked it, because according to the United Nations humanitarian aid spokesman, he pointed out just today that they had actually got permission from the Syrian government to deliver aid across the country. So it doesn't make sense that the Syrian government would actually give permission for humanitarian aid delivery and then attack a humanitarian aid convoy. Of course, this is the first time that this happens since the start of the unrest, and we know that the Syrian government has been allowing aid to enter militant-held areas across the country, whether we're speaking about Damascus countryside, Aleppo countryside, Madaya, Zabadani, Kfaria, Foua, or any other place. The situation on the ground currently is that the Syrian army resumed its military operations, particularly the airstrikes against terrorist groups, namely ISIL and Deir el-Zor. You have the al-Nusra Front, now named as Jabhat Fath al-Sham, and also the so-called Jaysh al-Fatah, which is of course mostly made up of the al-Nusra Front itself in Hama.
Andrew, you focused on this conflict for a very long time. What is your view in what is taking place right now? It seems that whenever there is some kind of diplomatic initiative, it is quickly cut off. We've seen the ceasefire breakdown. Now we see this UN convoy being bombed.
Yeah, I think it's a lesson in how the international brokers in this, the U.S. and Russia, actually don't have as much control over their respective clients as was first hoped. And I think, yesterday's bombing of the aid convoy, it's true we haven't been able to exactly determine who hit the convoy, but it was hit from the air, and the opposition doesn't have aviation. So unless it was a neighboring country or a UFO or something like that, it's hard to see how anybody else but the government is in a position to do that. But this deal was already going badly even before this bombing. The aid convoy had been delayed for some time. It was made clear in the deal from the American side that the aid had to leave Turkey, had to make it into Aleppo, and that the cessation of hostilities then would be restored in order for the Joint Implementation Center to go into place to target Jabhat Fath al-Sham and Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and ISIS together. That didn't happen. Then we had the coalition strike out in Deir el-Zor, the errant one that hit Syrian soldiers. So this deal is just not going well, and I'm afraid the ability of the international parties to control the Syrian civil war is more limited than we thought.
Mohammed, what can you tell us about the humanitarian situation in the eastern parts of Aleppo? There's about 275,000 people there who are trapped. They have no access to food, no access to medical supplies right now.
Well, of course, definitely in any place where militants are present, definitely the civilians will be suffering, because at the end of the day, they were the main reason that caused them such a suffering when they attacked coming from borders with Turkey, particularly when we speak about Aleppo, which is suffering the most. As you know, thousands of terrorists crossed the borders from Turkey in violation of United Nations resolutions like 2178, for example. And because of the terrorists' attacks during the unrest, of course, the civilians there are suffering. Now, we know that the Syrian government has allowed previously humanitarian aid to enter, and has opened 5 humanitarian corridors over there in order for the civilians who can reach those corridors from the eastern parts of Aleppo in order for them to exit. Of course, I have been in Aleppo just a month ago over there, and we've seen those corridors. Just today, there are tens of families who were able to exit out from the eastern parts of Aleppo. They were provided with humanitarian assistance directly by the Syrian army on site and then taken to temporary shelter centers. I am quite sure that any civilian that is able to reach that corridor from this side of the militant areas will actually do so, because living under militant-held areas and under the control of those Takfiri terrorists who are adopting an extremist Islamic interpretation and ideology are definitely not happy, and definitely will be able to go to the other side where the Syrian army controls it.
Andrew, if we look at the diplomatic efforts being made right now to defuse this crisis, the U.S., of course, has been making efforts for some time, but there is division in Washington over the approach, the strategy that is being adopted by the United States. Foreign Policy magazine reports that many U.S. diplomats and military officers are wary of a ceasefire agreement that calls for cooperating with Moscow on Syria, and that, of course, has led to a very vigorous debate in the White House on how this problem should be tackled. Why the divisions?
Because the problem is that we have multiple violations by both sides to the cessation of hostilities, and that includes the Syrian regime. And the coalition puts forward statistics every day, so does the regime, and so on. The biggest problem, I think, is that the approach isn't working, and so there's an idea: how do you get the Assad regime to follow through on its commitments that the Russians are supposedly getting them to agree to, including the aid. When the U.S. signed the agreement with Russia, the Russians said, yes, we will get the aid flowing. That didn't occur. And so after that, the question is, well, how can you get President Assad to come around to and to respect the cessation of hostilities? And that's led to a very vigorous debate about the use of airstrikes on President Assad and his forces. Now, that hasn't occurred yet. We did have the errant strike out near Deir ez-Zor on Syrian soldiers. The strikes against President Assad that were envisioned by some in Washington would be for violating the cessation of hostilities. So, for example, if they hit an aid convoy, as they did yesterday, or they didn't allow the aid in over a certain period of time, Assad regime military targets would be hit using offshore assets. That's one approach. The other approach is was what we've had for the last 5 years, and that is, do little or half measures, hoping that the regime comes around to understand that it has to abide by the agreements that the Russians sign. And that hasn't been working. And that's what's fueling the debate. And we still don't have an answer.
But Andrew, if you talk about using, say, cruise missile strikes or drone attacks on Syrian government forces on its airfields, would that not escalate the war? And what is the risk there of drawing Moscow deeper into this war? Yeah,
well, the war is already escalating. And I think the last couple of days shows that. You would have a risk if you had Russian government personnel at a military base that was struck. They're not at all military bases, however. Beyond that, there's not too much worry. I mean, there are sizable contingents of Hezbollah and other Shia militia which have to strengthen the Assad government's forces. If those were struck, I don't think that would be a big problem from an American standpoint. But it does beg the question, well, then what would the Russians do? They certainly could escalate in Syria, but they would still need troops, vital manpower, to retake and hold these areas of Syria, and they simply don't have them. They would have to put in troops to achieve that, or get Iran to send more militia over to Syria. But even that has been very difficult. Most estimates since the Russian bombardment last year, while it's saved the regime from collapse, it's only led to about 2 to 3% of Syrian territory being recaptured, and that's hardly the kind of numbers you need to achieve Bashar al-Assad's goal of recovering every inch of Syrian territory.
Mohammed, what is the Syrian government's preferred solution to this crisis, a civil war that's taking place in the country right now? Is it, do they want to retake every single inch of ground that they've lost during this war, as they have been telling us, or does the Syrian government believe that diplomacy, that negotiation will work in the end?
Well, since the start of the unrest here in Syria, the top officials, on top of which the President Bashar al-Assad has made it clear that the policy of the Syrian government has been based on 2 points. First, fighting terrorism, and second, trying to facilitate any kind of political solution that would lead to dialogue among the Syrians themselves. Now, Syria has not stopped giving statements that confirm that it will be ongoing with its policy in terms of fighting terrorism. Now, will it be able to secure every inch of Syria? This is something that no one really knows. However, it is something that the Syrian government, the Syrian army, will continue to try to achieve across the country, because it is the Syrian army's duty, according to the Syrian constitution, to secure every inch of land here across the country. Now, we know that the Syrian army has taken control of very important areas across the country with the help of its allies, particularly Russia, after, of course, the Russian Air Force started striking terrorist positions, particularly ISIL terrorists, or IS as it is called now, across the country, unlike, of course, what was happening before when the US-led coalition was solely operating and we saw only ISIL expanding. The Syrian government will continue for sure in fighting terrorism across the country. ISIL, Al-Nusra Front, the so-called Jaysh al-Fatah and other armed groups, because the Syrian government believes that it is only the Syrian army that is capable of doing so. Now, on the other hand, the Syrian government is carrying out reconciliation deals across the country. Any armed man that wishes to put down arms and surrender himself with the weapon to the Syrian government will be provided full amnesty by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and will directly, in less than 24 hours, go back to normal life and engage in political life across the country, and in any kind of dialogue that could actually happen between the Syrian government and the opposition.
Right, Andrew, do you believe that to be the case, that the Syrian government wants reconciliation, that it's prepared to offer amnesty to any single fighter that puts his arms down and says that he wants that?
I think that they would like a political settlement, but I think they would like it on their terms. The terms of the what they call ceasefires are after the areas have been besieged for quite some time, which is, a major violation of humanitarian law, and among other things. The issue about terrorism, I think the opposition certainly, and the international community looks at quite different. I think they also want to deal with terrorism there, but their concern is they don't think the Assad regime has the manpower to be able to achieve their military objectives. Russian and Western estimates of deployable manpower that can go outside of their current front lines by Syrian government forces, hover around 20,000 troops. That's nothing, and that's the reason why we see the government bringing in what the opposition and the international community, and some of them are UN-designated terrorist organizations on that side, but instead from the Shia variety instead of the Sunni variety. So a real mess. I think, however, that in the case of the current deal and the cessation of hostilities, I think the regime is trying to implement a military solution. It has a political component. They're hoping to get the opposition to surrender with Russian assistance. The only thing is that the opposition isn't giving in to that. So that's the reason why, as I said earlier, I think, unfortunately, the war will continue for some time.
Andrew, Tabler, Muhammad Ali, thanks to both of you for being with us. We are going to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll get the view from Moscow. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the military and humanitarian crisis in Syria. Joining us now from Moscow is political analyst and commentator Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We have been talking about the crisis in Syria right now. The ceasefire that was brokered by Russia and the United States has broken apart, fallen apart, and We now have an aid convoy which has been bombed inside the country. The United States is blaming Russia for this, and the United Nations says that whomever is responsible for this bombing, it is a war crime. Has there been any response from Russia?
Well, in Russia, the spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, he said that there were certainly no orders from the Kremlin to bomb any convoys. It is not immediately clear who hit that convoy, and I think we will know it in some time. But in general, a lot of Russian officials, including the military, they point to the fact that just less than 2 days ago, the Americans hit the Syrian army, killed 62 Syrian soldiers, and did not even apologize for that. So that bombing of the convoy is coming at a very convenient time for Washington to sort of redirect the public attention from what is for certain a mistake, a grave mistake by the US Air Force, to something that is supposedly a mistake of the Russian or Syrian Air Force.
The Americans and the Russians have been trying for some time now to work together to resolve this crisis in Syria, but there now appears to be a very public split between Russia and the United States after the US bombed Syrian forces, that bombing that you just talked about over the weekend. The United States says it was unintentional, but let's take a listen to how this panned out at the United Nations.
As you know, we convened the consultations of the Security Council because the United States has bombed the Syrian armed forces in Deir ez-Zor. It is quite significant and frankly suspicious that the United States chose to conduct this particular airstrike at this time. Why would all of a sudden the United States choose to help the Syrian armed forces defending Deir ez-Zor? After all, they did nothing when ISIL was advancing on Palmyra.
If we determine that we did indeed strike Syrian military personnel, that was not our intention. This said, even by Russia's standards, tonight's stunt, a stunt replete with moralism and grandstanding, is uniquely cynical and hypocritical.
So we have the United States there describing it as a stunt. That's Russia is coming out with moralism and grandstanding, the bombing that you were talking about.
Well, I think that there are obviously two lines in the American leadership on the situation in Syria. When we talked to the head of the State Department, John Kerry, he speaks out in favor of a compromise. He even said several times that we never insisted on Mr. Assad leaving power. But then you have Pentagon and you have several hawks in the administration of President Obama who use a very different language. So I think the language that we have just heard from Samantha Power, it is the language of that part, you know, the militant part of the American administration. As you saw, she just acknowledged that the United States, maybe by mistake, but still killed 62 soldiers of a foreign sovereign state, and the United States did not have the decency to apologize for that. And after that, Samantha Power is calling the Russian criticism of that killing cynical and grandstanding. I think our viewers can judge for themselves who is immoral or moral in this situation.
Right, we have the ceasefire that's broken down right now. When Russia looks at the situation, what are the options that Moscow has right now?
Well, Moscow has been striving for just one goal, or maybe two goals. The first goal is to have peace in Syria, to stop the violence, without the terrorist state, the so-called Islamic State, having any territory under its control in Syria or in Iraq, because we have lived through a terrible aggression of international terrorism in Chechnya in the 90s, and a lot of aid for the terrorists there came from Saudi Arabia. We don't want that story repeated now from the so-called Islamic State in Syria or in Iraq. So this is goal number one. Goal number two is to prevent the legally elected Syrian government from being ousted. That doesn't mean that Russia insists on Mr. Assad staying in power. It can be someone else, but that person who will be the next president, he has to be chosen by the Syrian people and not by some kind of national Syrian coalition, national Syrian council, the groups that only the Western countries recognized, that the Western countries, primarily the United States, change like gloves. First it was National Syrian Council, then it was National Syrian Coalition, then it was Free Syrian Army. So these groups have no right to appoint the new president. It's only the Syrian people at elections who will have the right to replace Mr. Assad by someone else.
If there are going to be attempts that are going to be made to try and rescue this ceasefire right now, to try and get the aid convoys to start moving again, what kind of cooperation would there be between the United States and Russia? Is there a command center where both parties are making the decisions on what happens?
Well, Russia has been suggesting to set up this kind of command center for a long time, and during the last long meeting between Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry, if you remember, it was decided to set up a consultation center that would try to differentiate, to divide the legitimate opposition to Mr. Assad and the terrorist groups. If you remember, Russia was the main lobbyist of the Geneva I talks. You know, the Western countries did not believe in Geneva I. They didn't want these talks to happen. So basically, Russia is for a compromise with the United States. But with the United States, you have a mixed picture. You have, as I told you, Mr. Kerry, who sounds like a peacemaker, but also you have Samantha Power, you have Susan Rice, you have the Pentagon chief, Ashton Carter. They use a very different language, not only towards Syria, but also towards Russia. So it's not immediately clear who has the real power in Washington, who decides what the American line on Syria is going to be.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Dmitry Babich, thanks for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arund Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.